Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear audience. As you would be knowing that today we are going to talk about a short introduction to the Quran, and this introduction is primarily based on the works of scholars like Hamiduddin Farahi, Amin Hasan Islahi, and our own teacher Jāvēd Ahmed Ghāmidī. So you would be knowing that recently there is a one-volume translation of the Quran in the Urdu language in which he has condensed his tafsir of 5 volumes. So I had the good fortune of translating his Urdu work into the English language, and it has now been published as a single volume, and I think it is available here as well. So today I'm going to just talk about introducing this translation to you, especially because it's in the English language, so perhaps some of the features of that translation, and as I said, it has about a century-old work behind it, so the works of his predecessor and of course his own predecessor, they also figure in this translation. And as far as this translation is concerned, I've tried my best to translate into contemporary English idiom so that our next generation, especially who are born and bred here, they are able to gauge and understand the Quran as far as possible. So I would be actually introducing the Quran to you, or this translation to be precise, in two facets, I would say. So one facet would be the style, or the stylistics, I would say, the genre of the Quran, and the second would be regarding the content, the nature of the content, how things have been arranged in the Quran, and how do we exactly understand the Quran when we move through the Quran, starting from Surah Fatiha and going right up to Surah Nas. So this would be how we proceed in basically understanding this particular area. And the first thing that I'd like to point this out is that as far as the Quran is concerned, it's the last scripture of humanity, and it's not just the first scripture as is generally introduced. It's not the first scripture of Islam. So it's like this last scripture of Islam, and as far as the previous scriptures were concerned, like for example, we know that the Torah was revealed to Moses, and the Injil was revealed to Jesus, and in between them we had Psalms revealed to David. So all of these prophets of God, the Quran says, and emphatically says, vehemently says, that they all brought down Islam, and as far as religion is concerned, it was all the same. It's just that the previous scriptures have not been preserved in their original language, and we have translations of these scriptures, but other than that, they are very close to what the Quran has as its message. And I think any one of you who has the chance of reading these previous scriptures would vouch for the fact that how close the Torah and the Injil are related to the Quran. So as far as the Quran is concerned, the distinction it has over the previous scriptures is just one, and that is that it is preserved in its original Arabic language. So we know that the Old Testament was revealed in Hebrew. The New Testament was revealed in Aramaic, and both these scriptures, they don't exist in the languages in which they were revealed. So we have translations of these originals. The originals do not survive, and hence, if you ask me, it was perhaps for this reason that when the Quran was revealed, the Almighty made up this promise, or He gave this promise to humankind in the Quran, that it shall be preserved until the day of judgment. And because it's going to be a substitute for divine guidance, hence it is all the more necessary that when the institution of prophethood is terminated, then there has to be some sort of divine guidance on which one can rely on. So the introduction to the Quran, as you can start off with, is that it's the original word of God that we have with us, and the distinction it has is its existence in its original language. And this of course also brings up this question that as far as these previous scriptures are concerned, they should not be regarded as redundant in any way. Because, as I said, the only thing is that they don't exist in their originals. But as far as translations are concerned, we have good translations of the previous scriptures. We might be reading them in the light of the Quran. And one major area which you can see in the Quran, which as the Quran says that the previous scriptures have been adulterated, is the area in which the arrival of the last prophet was clearly mentioned in the Quran. The Quran says that the previous scriptures say that they had the name of Muhammad, or Ahmad was his written actual name. Muhammad is his actually, it's his laqab, as we can see, but Ahmad was the name which is his original name, and the Quran says that this was mentioned in the previous scriptures, and today we don't find this mentioned obviously in the previous scriptures. So this is one area. Some of the other minor areas are there as well, but one major area in which the previous scriptures do not exist or do not have that particular area in them is this, are these prophecies of the arrival of the last prophet. But other than that, as I said, as far as the Sharia is concerned, as far as morality is concerned, you'll find an uncanny resemblance between the Torah and the Quran itself. So I'm going to talk about the style of the Quran first, and then once we are through with the style, some of the things which relate to its content. And when I talk about the content, I'd also, subdivide it vis-a-vis the topic of the Quran, and then the structure, the way it has been arranged, the way the surahs have been arranged in order to enhance and reinforce the topic. So the topic of the Quran and the way the structure of the Quran actually reinforces the topic of the Quran, we'll discuss once we start discussing the content. So this would be the order of our discussion today, as I said. So I'll start off with the style of the Quran, and then inshallah we'll go to the content with these two subcategories. Okay, so as far as the style of the Quran is concerned, now this is a very important area, I would say. And the reason for this is that we are not particularly used to the style of divine scriptures, the way we actually write a book. So for example, a book that a human being writes would have typically a title, and then of course there would be chapters, and the chapters would generally follow a sequence in which something would be built up. And finally, maybe near the last chapter, we would have a conclusion. So generally, books that human beings write, I'm talking about prose, books of prose, they generally are divided into chapters, and the chapters have their own paragraphs. The paragraphs, at times we have subtitles, we have subheadings, and as we move through various chapters, we can draw a conclusion. And this we would say is the ultimate aim, or the style, or the objective of the very book for which it was written. So this is how we human beings have generally been trained. But as far as the Quran is concerned, it is so unique in its structure and its content that you'll find that the way we write books, or the way we are used to reading books, is absolutely different from what the Almighty has gone about in the Quran especially. I can talk about the previous scriptures as well, but the Quran especially. So if you ask the Farai scholars, who I just named, the Farai scholars, of course, referring to the trio of Farahi, Islahi, and Ghamidi, the classification of the Quran. So when I talk about the Quran, the style of the Quran, I'm going to talk about the classification, which means that what exactly is the genre of the Quran. So is it a book of prose? Is it a book of poetry? Is it a book of history? Is it a book of quotations? Is it a book of philosophy? What exactly is the style and genre of the Quran? So as far as reading the Quran is concerned, I think any person here who is a serious reader of the Quran would see that there is some dialogue going on between various people of 7th century Arabia. So there is a conversation. The conversational element is very strong in the Quran. So as far as the Farai scholars are concerned, the first thing that they would come up while describing the Quran is that the genre of the Quran, the category of the Quran in which you can classify the Quran, is that it is a book of dialogues. It's a book in which people converse with each other. I can call these as divine dialogues, because the author is the Almighty himself. So there is a dialogue taking place between 7th century entities which existed in Arabia in those times. And as far as this dialogue is concerned, I'll just write down some features of that dialogue. But in order to compare that dialogue in the human plane, the dialogue that we are, for example, used to. So any of you who has the chance of reading the dialogues of Plato, for example, or for that matter, if you have a chance to read English literature and you would have read various plays, for example, Shakespeare, or some of the other scholars or some of the other literati who have written plays and dialogues, you'll find that generally in books of dialogues, or books which I can call plays, there is this structure is that normally we have an act, says act 1, and then it says scene 1. I'm sure anyone who's read English literature or any play would vouch that this is how things generally start. That first we have a list of people who speak in that dialogue, and then Act 1 basically is the first setting. It's the introductory setting of a play. And then we have a scene in which, of course, there is a scene created in which people are talking in a particular background. And then sometimes the scene changes. But as you can see, I think this has stopped working. So scene 2 would be typically in which the basic setting is the same, but you can see there are subdivisions. So it's more like having a chapter in which you have a subheading, and then you have another subheading. If you just compare it to the human plane, what happens is then in the next subheading, the topic proceeds, it advances in the forward direction, and something new comes up. But the title, which follows, is basically the same. It's like the chapter would be the same. So an act could be compared to a chapter. The chapter would be the same, but the scenes would be like headings, for example, another heading. And just as in a play, you'll find those scenes changing. You'll find some subject matter being introduced here, and then another subject matter being introduced here with a common theme that they still belong to the same chapter. So the scenes, they still belong to the same act. So if this is slightly understood, I mean, if you're even sparingly understanding this, I'm just going to make it a little more easier perhaps. And once you understand this is how the structure of a play or a structure of a book of dialogues is, let me also further illustrate to you that as far as the Quran is concerned and all these books of dialogues are concerned, you'll often see, I'm just going to take the example of Shakespeare, for example. So we have the famous play of Shakespeare called Julius Caesar. So, of course, this play was written in the backdrop of Roman history, and Julius Caesar, as you all know, was one of the Roman emperors. And when Shakespeare wrote this play, so we had characters, for example, we had Brutus, we had Cassius, we had Cicero, I mean, so on and so forth. So the point that I'm trying to make is that whenever you read a book of dialogues, you'll have typically the name of the person who is speaking written on the left, then there would be a colon, and then whatever he speaks is written right here. And similarly, the next person would come up, he would reply to Brutus, for example, Cassius would reply typically to Brutus, and whatever is said here, I mean, whatever he speaks, is written right in front of that. So this is a typical structure of any play. You pick up any play, you'll find the characters being written on the left, and on the right in front of them you have a colon, which of course would mean that whatever this person is going to utter is going to be placed right ahead. I think this is something you might have come across, and this is something very common. So what I'm trying to say here is that the Quran exactly follows the same pattern. It's like a book of dialogues between various entities. The only difference is that I replace these names with other names, and I don't write them on the left. I mean, I would not typically say, for example, that Prophet Muhammad is speaking. And so you'll not find in the Quran the name of Muhammad, qala Muhammad, and then, for example, whatever he uttered would be said in a sentence. And similarly, if the addressees were, for example, let's say the idolaters or the people of Quraysh who were his nation, so you'll not find in the Quran, this layout in which the person who speaks his name is written here, and for example, the person to whom he speaks to is then written here, and then there is a dialogue back and forth, and at times we have several people in the same dialogue. So if you just imagine the Quran, that if you just delete, for example, the names of these the people, so for example, as I said, in our plays, in our books of dialogues, we'll typically have the names of the people written here, and the people will be speaking, and of course the conversation would be right in front of you. So what has happened in the Quran, that you'll not find the names of the characters written the way we find in our books. This is something that we generally understand from the context and the text itself. And it is here that one of the most difficult areas of the Quran at times that we come across is that you find this abrupt conversation. At times there's someone is being spoken to, and suddenly you find a tremendous shift in the subject, and something new comes up. And the reason that this shift is taking place, and which is causing hiccups to us, and which makes us realize that perhaps there is this disjointedness, if you, more often than not, if you realize, you'll find that basically the conversation, for example, if I'm conversing and I have 2 or 3 or 4 people sitting right in front of me, so I'm going to talk to you regarding your problem, I'm going to talk to you regarding the issue that is at hand with yourself, and similarly, and so forth. So my conversation is like a ray that's going from right and left and right. And precisely for this reason, that at times when you find that disjointedness, it is because we don't realize that it's not the speech which has changed or the topic has changed. The person who is being spoken to has changed. So a lot of disjointedness in the Quran, which generally people or advanced students find that there was a topic discussed and suddenly we have a new topic, and you fail to find any connection of the next topic with the previous topic. On most occasions, this is not because there is any abrupt change in the topic. It's actually the change in the speaker or the spoken to. So, for example, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was speaking to one group of people, like the hypocrites, and when his particular conversation with them finished, he would just shift to the next group standing right in front of him, and he would talk about the mushrikun regarding their own beliefs, which are, of course, or would be, of course, entirely different from the hypocrites. So it's like an array of speakers or array of spoken to people which keep on shifting, and they keep on rapidly changing. And this change in the shorter surahs of the Quran, at the end of the Quran, you'll find is very rapid. It's like a rapid fire in which people are speaking and the spoken to is being changed. And as I said, at the same time, remember what I said in the beginning, the act and the scenes, they also rapidly change. So bringing us back to the same analogy as English literature would generally offer us. By the way, other literatures are also not different. I mean, no different. For example, in Urdu or in Persian or in Arabic, you'll find the same difference. So just as the speakers are changing rapidly, and you're not realizing this because in our own plane, in the human plane, we can easily recognize the change because the name is written here. And when you find the name written here, you immediately recognize, yes, the speaker has now changed. But in the Quran, this is something that you have to decide for yourself. Similarly, the acts and the scenes which change because of the heading which is already there, you're not going to find this in the Quran, because this is something, again, that when you study a surah, which is the chapter of the Quran, you will have to divide that chapter or that own surah through your own analysis into various sections, which I call the scenes, which change the scene or the scenario. Some new scenario comes up, and in each scenario, this conversation is taking place. And as I said, rapidly, you'll find the Quran changing from one speaker to another, changing not only in this conversation, but also at times the settings change. I'm trying to slightly oversimplify, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that one of the things that we have to understand regarding the Quran is the style of the Quran is the book of dialogues, it's a book of conversation, it's a book between people who are real entities of 7th century Arabia. So, for example, you'll find the Prophet Muhammad, you'll find the mushrikun, you'll find the idolaters, you'll find the people of the book, and then you'll find Satan speaking as well. You'll find the angels speaking as well. So people who are living in 7th century Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula of those times, they are the characters, I would say, who speak to one another, and their speech is now preserved in the Quran in its ultimate way. Now, the most important conclusion that can be drawn from this is that as far as entities which did not exist in 7th century Arabia, they're not going to be talked about, because it's a living dialogue between people who are living there. So this golden question often comes up, that why is it that the Quran, for example, does not discuss Buddhism or Hinduism, two huge religions which existed in the time of the revelation of the Quran, but they were never talked of. So this is one of the things that we often get. So the simple answer to that would be that because of the fact that the Quran is a book of dialogues between people who were living in Arabia in those times, it's a living dialogue. We didn't have any Buddhist or a Hindu living in Arabia at that time. So the reason that they are not brought up as a subject in the Quran, in spite of the fact that they were larger, I mean, one of the largest religions at the time that the Quran was being revealed. So although they existed in Asia, for example, far away, but the Quran never talked about them. Precisely for this reason, that this dialogue is between people who were living at that time, and as a result, because of the fact that this dialogue took place between living individuals of those times, there are certain specifics which means that this dialogue actually encompasses a certain type of conversation which is specific to the era of the Prophet, and there is another type of conversation which, if understood properly, can be extended beyond the era of the Prophet. So, for example, there is a localized conversation taking place because, of course, that localized conversation relates to people who are living there. And then there is a specialized conversation which can be extrapolated from that localized conversation, in which you can generalize. So the first point in the background of what I've just said is that as far as the Quran is concerned, it is a book of dialogues. Its stylistics should not be confused as a universal book that we are generally aware of. We think that the Quran is a book which has a solution to every single thing, and therefore we have to find in the Quran, and you open up the Quran and you find things of biology and physics and chemistry and social sciences as is the Quran is generally introduced. So the first thing that we have to understand is that if this is a book of dialogue, it's a book of dialogues between people who were living in 7th century Arabia. Then there was a certain content of which the Quran spoke of very specifically. And this brings me to the next step, which I'm now going to discuss, that as far as this dialogue is concerned, then what exactly is the content of this dialogue? How do we relate to this dialogue? Are we also the addressees of this dialogue? Because we are not living there. I mean, it was a dialogue between people who lived there. We are living 14 centuries apart. So how does that dialogue, which took place between 7 or 8 entities of those times, relate to us? So this would bring me to the next topic, or the next particular area that I would like to discuss with you, so that once we are through with this and we are able to understand the structure of this dialogue, you'll be able to understand that how specific the Quran at times is, and how it has been perhaps misunderstood in many areas just because of not realizing that parts of this dialogue are very specific, and some other parts are something which can be extended beyond the area. Presently, we've just reached this point that as far as the structure of the Quran is concerned, as far as the genre, the category of the Quran is concerned, that it's a book of dialogues. And I think that any one of you who would be reading the Quran, even in English, you'll find that the words "he said," "it was said," "it was said to them," "he spoke like this," any good translation you'll find. And if you just go home and underline the words "said" and the word, any inflections of "said," which would be to say, or to say to anything which is equivalent to this meaning, for example, to state something, to mention something, you'll find an abundance of the word qala, of course, which is the word which is used in the Quran for to speak. So the qala, yakulu, kulto, these are all inflections of this word. And any one of you who's not even aware of Arabic, if you read a good translation, you'll find that he said that, he said this, such and such people said that. So the conversation element would stand out. It's just that at times we fail to notice it. So my request to you would be that if you are able to grasp this conversation, then when you go home and you study the Quran as you would be doing in your general study, just pick up any 4 or 5 lines and 6 lines, you'll find that there is a conversational element deeply embedded in the Quran. And if that conversation is, paid attention to, you'll find yourself being so focused that as the addressees change, so you see, sometimes the speaker changes, and sometimes the spoken to changes at the same time. So there's a speaker who's going to speak, and of course then there are people to whom his speech is addressed. So just as you'll find the speaker changing rapidly at times, you'll also find that the words that are being addressed to a certain entity, they are also changing at the same time. So there is a change in the speaker and there is a change in the spoken to. And if this is accounted for, I can out of my own experience, I can tell you that a lot of disjointedness in the Quran, a lot of incoherence in the Quran that you might find when you're reading the Quran will take care of itself, because you then realize that the speech is between people who are constantly changing, and the speech actually relates to the beliefs or their own ideas of that particular group. And because those speeches and ideas are specific to different people, so the hypocrites would be having a different belief, the idolaters would be having a different belief, and then there would be different issues that would be discussed. For example, the chapters, as I said, they represent the act. So the act would change, the scene would change, and as I said, this rapid shift of speaker and spoken to, if you are able to gauge that, even from a good translation, I can really tell you that you'll discover a new Quran. You'll discover an entirely new Quran, because now you are paying attention to that dialogue element. And this is one of the contributions, one of the big contributions of the translation that, as I said, started off with Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi, and as it went on, its latest edition by Ustaz Jāvēd Ahmed Ghāmidī has made this crystal clear that how important this dialogue element pervades through the Quran. So before I go on, I can see that there's a question you have.
I'm a little bit confused. So we always understand the Quran as the spoken words of Allah, right? So if the speaker is changing, so that's confusing me a little bit. And then how then that becomes different from hadith?
Right.
Because
Right.
there's a lot of dialogue there.
Okay, so you see, God is the author of these divine dialogues.
Right.
So the speaker, when the speaker is changing, it is in the authorship of the Quran, of God Himself, that various people who are parts of this dialogue, they're going to change. So, for example, when Prophet Muhammad is speaking, he is speaking in the words which God has actually narrated.
Right.
So basically, it's the authorship of all these dialogues is with God. So it cannot be compared to hadith in any way. So the author is the Almighty Himself, and at times you'll find Him speaking as well. So as part of that dialogue, He's perhaps the most dominant speaker as well. So God is one of the speakers, and the rest of the 6 or 7 entities which I just named before you, so they are all speaking in between them. And it's always authored by God. So when even Satan is speaking, when you find Satan speaking, it's not that Satan is actually speaking himself. So God is actually narrating it. So this is what we call hikayat. So it's like a hikayat, something which is of a narration. So it's a narration from the Almighty, but the words have been put in the mouth of those entities. Right. Okay.
You're referring to style, and in the style, you are referring to the style the book is written, and it is unprecedented, as you expressed that. But the language also play with any of the message that is delivered at certain point. That language also has an evolution, and at one point it is different, and the other point it you can say develops, or human develop around it, and that changes too. So as a divine message, it's our understanding that message is constant. But our understanding to that message, that also
it does change.
Develops or changes with time. And there's one thing that I understand, that language at that time was language of poets. They used a lot of symbols and a lot of istara, and
So you can say it was a literary language. It was literary. The language of the Quran it's a masterpiece of literature. So basically, it was a literary language. So what is the question that you have?
The question I have is that whom it was being addressed can change the meaning as a message, not the meaning, but the message can be changed, because someone who is not able to understand, not get at the pitch of it, can apprehend it differently, and the other person who's getting at the pitch of it get it differently.
Right.
So that's my question. That how.
So this is how any book that you come across would be written, that unless you are able to understand the background, the speech itself, and the context, this is something which will be a situation that arises in almost every book. So the Quran is no different. You see, our own understanding regarding the Arabic language, it improves with time, and every time you come back to the Quran, you find that maybe you missed out something, whereas it was always there, and things, your own understanding has actually improved. So your own understanding, or human understanding, goes through this evolution, and as a result, that your own understanding brings you to better options, and you will start understanding the Word of God. So I would say this is not just a property of the Quran or the Arabic language. This is something which holds true for all books, and it holds true for our own understanding.
So I actually I agree. I agree with what he's saying, because it's not necessarily a book as it was delivered, right? It's a dialogue that was delivered through the messenger to whoever they were talking to. So I'm having a little difficulty trying to compared to a book as such, because it could be not in a book form.
Well, it was in a book form, and it was given to us.
Not in the beginning, though, right?
In the beginning, it was written down, and it was transmitted in the oral form, exactly in the same pattern.
No, the pattern. What I mean is, you're right, but I mean physically, it, you know, if I was to, let's say physically it wasn't in a book, and somebody was saying that to me, if it was being said to me, I might interpret it differently, and said to somebody else, they would think of it differently.
So you see, this is where the context comes in.
Okay.
Whenever you understand a book, as I said, this is regardless of the Quran, you have to have a context. So every sentence has a paragraph, and every paragraph is situated in a context. Every context has a larger context, which is the context of the surah, which we call a chapter. So if we read the Quran through the flow and through its fluency, we will still might make errors, but they would be minimized. It is because that people pick and choose, and they just end up, reading one verse without giving due regard to the previous verses, that we have those differences. Okay, so if this first part is slightly clear that this is a book of dialogues, then I'd like to speak next on what exactly is the major topic of this dialogue, because it is here that we need to understand that a lot of Quran has been unfortunately misunderstood, and you'll find that the Quran quoting the Almighty saying some very harsh words in the Quran. For example, you kill the disbelievers, or you chop off their necks, or you don't befriend non-Muslims, and you don't pray for their forgiveness. So there is a lot of content in the Quran which immediately, as soon as I enter the Quran, it stares me in the eye. It tells me that, well, God is angry, something is wrong, and the way He's addressing people, yes, we have very affectionate verses, yes, we have God reminding us of a lot of things that we really cherish, but more often than not, we find God speaking of past nations, the destruction of those past nations. We find cyclones and storms destroying those people, and then in particular we find the surahs of the Quran in which the believers are given this directive that you just finish off these disbelievers if they are not listening to you. So this is an area that, of course, is something that was part of that major dialogue which took place in 7th century Arabia. And by not understanding that this dialogue was governed by a specific law of the Almighty, and that law is something which cannot be extended beyond the era of Prophet Muhammad, that we have ended up in a lot of confusion. So as far as the topic of this dialogue is concerned, that is what I'm not going to discuss. But as I said, this topic is something of paramount importance, and if we are able to understand this topic, we will then understand it, how specifically this topic is found in the Quran, and how we have to relate to this topic and not directly follow what is written, because this topic specifically relates to the law of the Quran, or law of the Quran, which relates to the messengers of God. And I think you must have heard of this term, Itmamul Hujjah. A lot of times from Ustaz and from Tadabbur Quran and from Al-Bayan and so many things that we talk about. So one thing that often stands out when we speak about the Quran is that there's Itmamul Hujjah taking place, and people are then taken to task after that. So basically, this dialogue it relates to that Itmamul Hujjah. What does that mean? It means that the truth is communicated to the addressees in such an ultimate way by the Prophet of God that they are not left with any excuse to deny it. So the simple term of Itmamul Hujjah means that the Almighty, through His messengers, conveys the truth. And what is the truth? The truth is that we are born as creatures, and one day we'll be held accountable before Him on the Day of Judgment. So this accountability basically is the topic of the Quran. And this topic of the Quran is made to pass through that dialogue so that we are not able to forget that accountability in any way. But as I said, it has a lot of specifics. And that's, unless we understand those specifics, we might end up doing something which the Quran never wants us to do, and it has a very specific context to that. So I'm now not going to talk about the concept of Itmamul Hujjah, and of course which forms the bulk of the topic of the Quran, and which would mean that there is this warning which is being issued by the Almighty in a certain way, that if you don't accept the truth, then you are doomed. Because not accepting the truth is not out of any confusion or ignorance. It is because you understand the truth fully, you are convinced, and in spite of being convinced, you deny the truth. So this is the concept that brings us to the next topic, which is the topic of the Quran itself. So I'm just going to try to make sense of this and I'm going to oversimplify some of the things, because as you can see that there are some issues that need a lot of time to explain, but just to make them a little more palpable in this short time, I'm going to just oversimplify certain things, but of course you can ask questions so that we can fill some of the blanks that might be created as a result. So the thing that we're discussing is this topic of the Quran, and this topic, in fact, is something which pervades that dialogue. Remember, we just said that the Quran is a book of dialogue. So the topic that we're going to discuss today is something which is found in those dialogues which took place between the Prophet himself, between the Almighty, and the rest of the people who were there in Arabia. Okay, so in order to understand this topic, let me draw this line for you. And as I said, it's a slight oversimplification. So let's see that this is the history of mankind. This is the religious history of mankind. So we had Adam here as the first prophet of God. And then there was a period of time in which prophets of God were sent. And right at the end of that period, we had Prophet Muhammad, on whom the institution of prophethood was terminated. So for ease of categorizing this period, I call it the prophetic period. Why? Because this is the period in which prophets of God were sent to deliver the truth, and as I said, there was a certain law which was governed by the whole era, which I'm just going to discuss that. And then let's say that this is the time when the world will end. This is the D-Day, the Day of Judgment, and I mean this is the time when we will just be raised before the Almighty. We are perhaps living somewhere here, just a hypothetical thing. What is it? Is it 1444? Somewhere like this. So it's like 2022. So this should not be taken to mean that the Quran, that the Day of Judgment is still far off. This is just a hypothetical thing. This could be very near as well. This could be right here. It's just a hypothetical thing. Okay. So the D-Day, or the Day of Judgment. So this is how I would say that we are placed. And again, for ease of description, I would say that this is the post-prophetic era. See, so the religious history of mankind can be easily divided into the prophetic era and the post-prophetic era. And then we have the Day of Judgment, of course, the eternal life right out of there. I cannot go beyond that. But as you can see, that the basic feature of this Day of Judgment is accountability. I mean, all of us would be called to account, and then this reckoning is going to take place. I'm sorry, it's not very visible here, but it's accountability. So as far as this era is concerned, it is clearly spanned over thousands of years. I mean, maybe several thousand years. And this is just about 2,000 years that we have gone through after the departure of Prophet Muhammad. So a very long prophetic era from Adam to Muhammad, and a very short post-prophetic era until now. So if you are able to gauge this oversimplified diagram, the feature of the Day of Judgment is, as I said, that the accountability is going to take place. So everyone who is living from here to here would be made to rise here. They will be resurrected. Account would be taken from them, and then they will be consigned to either hell or heaven. So basically, the Almighty wants us to understand, and I can say that just as Itmamul Hujjah, which means delivering the truth, the ultimate extent, is a topic of the Quran, but in a broader context, the real topic of the Quran is this accountability, which is going to take place in the hereafter. Now, we human beings living here in the post-prophetic era, we tend to forget this accountability. I mean, of course, every day we are made to realize of this accountability through our own conscience, through our own fitrah, through a lot of things. But then again, this accountability, it continues to elude us, isn't it? I mean, we do bad things and suddenly we realize, and one of the reasons that we do these things or we succumb to sin is that at that particular moment, that accountability, the sense of that accountability has deluded us. and we just end up doing that, and then suddenly we realize that we come back to God. So this accountability is something which the Almighty wants us to always keep in mind, because this is the crux of human life. If you forget accountability, you'll just draw far away from the Almighty. Now what happens is that in the prophetic era, now please do listen carefully, in the prophetic era, which is of course, which started from Adam and it ended on Muhammad, messengers of God were sent, as you can see. So I'm just going to classify them as M1, M2. So all these are messengers of God. For example, we had Noah, we had Abraham, we had Jesus, we had Moses, we had finally we had Prophet Muhammad. So all these messengers of God, I mean, it's not just, so God himself actually, who's going to take this accountability in the hereafter, he says that in order to make this accountability a visual reality, he has created lesser days of judgment in the time of every messenger of God. So every messenger of God creates a smaller day of judgment in his own life. So there's a greater day of judgment in which everyone will be called to account, but there is a lesser day of judgment which every single messenger of God creates on the face of the earth in his own times. And what happens is that he comes to earth as a representative of God, delivers the truth, and tells his addressees that don't forget this accountability. If you forget this accountability, then your own accountability is going to take place in this very world, because I, as a representative of God, have come to you with the truth. If you deliberately deny it, then your heaven and hell will start right here. You'll be doomed. Thus, for example, if you read the Quran, you'll find that those natural disasters which came to earth, for example, in the form of cyclones and tempests and so many other forms, they destroyed these nations of God when they deliberately denied the truth. So the Almighty says that these lesser days of judgment were created in the times of every messenger of God, in which their accountability, that greater accountability, has to take place on the day of judgment. But on a smaller scale, this accountability is taking place in the era of every messenger, and the process is almost the same. The truth is delivered by the messenger as God's representative, and once that truth has been delivered in the ultimate form, if they intentionally deny it, the Almighty tells the messenger that you leave the place of your nation, just go away, just migrate from that place. Now I'm going to take care of them myself. So through tempests, through storms, through earthquakes, these addressees are denied. So I think you have heard about the Samud, the people of Lot, the people of Shuaib. All of them, they were actually nations of God to whom these messengers were assigned, and they were told that if you don't understand this, if you don't acknowledge the truth, then you will be doomed in this world. So their accountability took place right in this world. And then this whole account was preserved in the Quran for us who are living in the post-prophetic era, so that every time that we read the Quran, we find that people who are going to deny their prophets of God, they are punished in this world for their denial. The only difference was that in the times of Prophet Muhammad, the Almighty said that the instruments of God's justice, instruments or the weapons of God's justice, which in the previous cases were elements of nature, like for example, earthquakes, cyclones, tempests, etc. This time, the Almighty said that they will be replaced by the swords of the believers. So if they are going to deny a messenger of God, intentionally deny the truth, then just as in the previous cases, cyclones and elements of nature punished the addressees for their denial, and remember it was a deliberate denial, and annihilated them. They were totally wiped out. The Almighty said in his case, to make it even more visual this time, the punishment which formerly took place through elements of nature will now take place through the swords of the believers. Thus, for example, just as people would be punished for polytheism in the hereafter, the Almighty says that he would not allow people to live on polytheism. He's going to forgive any other sin, but not polytheism. So proponents of shirk or polytheism are going to be put to hell in the hereafter, and that's going to be an eternal hell if they do it intentionally. So the Almighty says that in these lesser days of judgment as well, the pattern would be the same. Exactly the same pattern is going to be repeated. That people who ascribe to polytheism, they are going to be punished in this world, and they are going to be put to death. So in the times of Prophet Muhammad, the mushrikun who are professing faith, who is professing idolatry themselves, they were to be put to death. just as, I mean, they would be put to death on the Day of Judgment, or to name it another way, they will be punished. So that punishment took the form of death in this world. So just as the mushrikun were dwelt with death through cyclones, through earthquakes, through various other phenomena, in the times of Prophet Muhammad, it was ordained that this time the weapons of destruction would not be the elements of nature. It would be the weapons, those weapons would take place in the form of the swords of the disbelievers. So they were told that if you have any mushrik living, then you have to kill him, because he is someone who's not going to be spared on the Day of Judgment. Neither are you going to spare him today, because this is a lesser Day of Judgment. So it's just that greater Day of Judgment, the pattern that is going to take place on that greater Day of Judgment is going to be repeated on those lesser days of judgment, as I said, with this distinction that this time Prophet Muhammad's companions are going to deliver that punishment. And therefore, if you find the Quran telling believers that they have to kill off, they have to chop the necks of these idolaters, it is not a general law. It is a law which is governed by this prophetic period, in which only messengers of God are allowed to create those lesser days of judgment, so that once those lesser days of judgment are created, then exactly the same pattern as the greater day of judgment is going to ensue. That is going to take place in this world as well. So if you find those harsh verses in the Quran which tell you to wipe off the idolaters, or for example people who are proponents of monotheism, for example the people of the book, so they were told that they would be spared, their life would be spared, they would not be killed, and they would be allowed to live on their own religion if they pay the jizya tax and they live in subservience to the Muslim state. Thus, for example, in the times of Prophet Muhammad, the mushrikun and the people of the book, remember these are the two basic denominations, the basic divisions, the idolaters and the people of the book. So for idolaters, the destruction was that they would be killed. The punishment was that they would be killed, just as the punishment in the hereafter for them is shirk or polytheism is not going to be spared. For the people of the book, they would be allowed to live because they were basically monotheists, but they would be given a certain amount of punishment. So similarly, on the Day of Judgment, people who adhere to Tawheed or monotheism, they would be given a certain amount of punishment, and then of course they would be either lifted out from hell or taken out from hell, or as I said, certain other forms of punishment would be given to them, but they would be spared ultimately. So exactly what is going to happen on the Day of Judgment happened in the times of Prophet Muhammad, because it was actually God. He said that this is something that I'm going to do on the Day of Judgment, and this is what I'm going to do in the times of the lesser days of judgment as well. So therefore, the Quran, when it speaks of, because the Quran is a book which belongs to the prophetic period, so therefore, when it speaks of killing these disbelievers, when it speaks of not making friends with them, it is actually telling us that as far as God is concerned, He has now created this final day of judgment on earth. So as far as we are concerned, who are living in this post-prophetic era, we should draw a lesson from this whole phenomena which took place in all the messengers of God, and finally in the times of Prophet Muhammad as well, that people had been dispatched, I mean they were killed or they were wiped off or they were threatened for this purpose, the way they would do on the Day of Judgment. But the only thing is that this law does not extend beyond the prophetic period. So whatever God's messengers did stays with them. It cannot be projected in the post-prophetic period. Why? Because, as I said, the law relates to prophets of God. So God is actually delivering the judgment through His messengers. In the post-prophetic era, there are not going to be any messengers. I mean, the messengerhood has stopped here. It has terminated here. So in the post-prophetic era, all that we have are people like us who can make mistakes, who can live as common human beings. I mean, we have good lives, we have good days, we have bad days. And so therefore, as far as this prophetic period is concerned, some of the practices which are specific to the era of the prophets of God cannot be extended. Like, for example, punishing people for apostasy, or punishing people for shirk, or punishing people for bad practices, whatever. Because this was something which only took place in the times of the messengers of God, and this was a practice which was meant to be undertaken in the times of these messengers, so that this whole practice could then be enshrined in the Quran, and people like us who are living in the post-prophetic period, we are told that if our accountability is not taking place in this world, because remember, the accountability of these nations took place in this world, and they were either destroyed or rewarded. But for us, our accountability has been postponed to the Day of Judgment. So the message to us is that you're living in this post-prophetic era, if you're doing good or if you're doing bad and not being punished or rewarded immediately, don't think that this is not going to happen. Your accountability is just being deferred to the day of judgment. Why? Because if accountability is the norm, if it is the norm, and if it took place in the first era, it cannot be, in any way believed that the Almighty is going to hold accountable these people and not hold accountable these people. So their accountability took place in this world, but our accountability is deferred to the day of judgment. And when we constantly read the Quran, we'll find out that how important this theme of accountability is. And we must not forget that if we are not being held accountable today, then this is going to happen. But the only thing is that that our accountability is pushed to the day of judgment. So this is something so important that if we don't realize this, we'll find verses of the Quran which relate to the prophetic era. For example, as I said, the most important of them is that you start killing disbelievers or you wage war with the disbelievers. As I said, that was something which only belonged to the era of the Prophet. So for example, if the idolaters were being threatened with death, it was because they belonged to the prophetic era, and therefore this was the punishment that they had to face. But as I said, in the post-prophetic era, this cannot be extended. So people like, for example, I can say Mullah Omar or, for example, Abu Bakr Baghdadi. Similarly, you have people like Osama bin Laden. All of them, they invoke these Quranic verses which are basically meant for the prophetic period, and they say that since it is laqad kana lakum fi rasulillahi uswatun hasana, that the example of the Prophet is the best thing, and since he killed disbelievers, or he was authorized to kill disbelievers, so we too can continue with this job. So by not understanding this law of the Quran, this law of Itmamul Hujjah, this law of accountability, this law of this lesser day of judgment being created only in the times of the Messenger of God, we living in this prophetic era and seeing that this is something which the Quran tells us, and thinking that, well, we have to follow the Quran come what may, and whatever the previous prophets did, we have to follow that in letter and spirit, we have become inadvertently guilty of playing the role of God. So God had played this role only in the times of his messengers, and he deferred that role to the day of judgment. So today, if we don't realize this distinction, as I said, then it is so easy to extend these prophetic verses of the Quran into the post-prophetic era, and then ultimately think that we are also the adversaries of these verses, and therefore we have to kill disbelievers or at least threaten them or not make friends with them. So remember, all these harsh verses of the Quran, they are basically punishments for those people who are guilty of intentionally denying the truth. So today, one golden question that I know you would be asking, or it might have cropped up in your mind, that then what exactly is the relevance of these verses if they are not applicable today for people living in this era? Because if you cannot kill disbelievers, if all the harsh verses are meant for the prophetic era, then why have they been left like this? Because we are not going to follow the verses in letter and spirit. So the answer again to that is that the purpose of leaving these verses here and to make them a sort of an example for us is that when we read their stories, we always have this in mind, that this accountability that these nations passed through is a reality. It took place for them in this world. We have to realize that our accountability is also at hand. It can come anytime, but it might not come in this world, but yes, definitely in the hereafter. So this whole saga, I would say, this whole saga in the Quran, the way it has been mentioned in various phases for various messengers, has been left there so that we read this accountability of these nations and realize that our own accountability is also going to take place. So this is the biggest relevance. But then the other most important thing is that we have to realize this, that as far as the Quran is concerned, some of the verses which I just spoke of, they have a very specific area of application. And if we say that the Quran speaks of killing disbelievers or waging war against them, or for example not befriending them, then it's talking about the prophetic era. Today, when we are living in the post-prophetic era, our relationship with our non-Muslim brethren in all sorts of forums has to be congenial, it has to be friendly, it has to be in a way that we come close to them. We as Abrahamic, I would say followers of the Abrahamic religions, we come closer to them, we discuss our scriptures. Remember in the very beginning I said that the Quran is so close to the Torah and the Injil that you find its message so I mean, so much in common. So this is the era in which, when we are living, instead of invoking these verses and extrapolating them and extending them in the prophetic era, in the post-prophetic era, and thinking that today, while living in the United States, our children cannot befriend non-Muslims, they have to be at variance with them, they have to show animosity to them, and ultimately our goal is to capture the whole globe. As you can see, the general Muslim understanding in this regard is that the target that they give Muslims is that they have to capture the rest of the world, bring it under their subjugation, and no other person or no other denomination has the right to rule. Only Muslims have the right to rule. So this is all because they have misunderstood this whole phenomena in the times of the Prophet of God. Neither were the Sahaba extending the frontiers of their empire. I mean, they were not extending their frontiers in any way. They were waging war to punish people for denying the truth. So it was basically a punishment of God, which, as I said, is going to be meted out on the Day of Judgment, but was also meted out on those lesser days of judgment. So whatever was done was basically a punishment, and that punishment is going to be repeated. And today, because there's no messenger of God, so God is not in communion with us. I mean, He does not communicate with us anymore. So therefore, as I said, even if today people exist who deny the truth intentionally, we cannot pinpoint them. We just cannot pinpoint it, because denying the truth is something which relates to your intentions. And even prophets of God never had this prerogative. They could not give this punishment themselves. It was God who told a prophet of God that now the truth has been delivered. God says, I know the intentions of the people. So people who are standing right in front of you, you must now realize that, as per my information, God says, I can tell you that their denial is intentional. And you can see the Quran replete with verses which say, for example, it would say, min ba'di ma tabayyana lahumul haqq, that they kafaru min ba'di ma tabayyana lahumul haqq, which means that they denied once the truth was evident to them. So God says that this evidence of the truth is not something which even a messenger can know. I will tell my messenger, because intentionally denial is something which relates to your heart, and only God knows what is in the hearts. So today, even if there are people who are denying intentionally, and by the way, for them the word kafir is used. So the word kafir, the way it has been used generally in the Quran, is for someone who has intentionally denied the truth. In spite of knowing the truth, he continues to deny it. So even if today there are people who could be kafirs because they are someone who have denied intentionally, but we cannot pinpoint them, because in the times of messengers of God, God pinpointed them Himself and gave this information to messengers. Today He does not. So therefore, today the right term to use for a person who does not belong to the teachings of, or does not follow the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, is not a kafir, but the word non-Muslim should be used. So for all non-Muslims living today, whether the Jews or Christians or the Hindus or the Sikhs or anyone, they have to, we have to live with them in harmony. We have to communicate with them in harmony. And above all, we need to realize that when the Quran speaks of Jews and Christians in its own times, they are not the same Jews and Christians of our times. This is the most important lesson. The Jews and Christians of the times of Prophet of God, they were condemned because of this intentional denial. Today, neither can we know that intentional denial, nor was the truth delivered to them because there was no messenger. We are not in a position to deliver the truth. We are ordinary human beings who make so many errors. So therefore, today, this category does not exist. And in the post-prophetic era, our relationship with our non-Muslim brethren has to be, as I said, congenial. It has to be amicable. It has to be friendly. And it has to be in a way that we are not apologetic in any way. But because out of our own understanding of the scripture, we know that in the post-prophetic era, the order of the day is to live in peace and harmony, and to defer making judgments, because this is God's domain. And He has said that I'll do that on the Day of Judgment. And you can see so many verses of the Quran saying to the effect that يَفْصِلُ بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فِي مَا كَانُوا فِيهِ يَخْتَلِفُونَ, which means that I'm going to decide what the truth is, because your people are not in a position to do so. And therefore you leave this matter to me on the Day of Judgment. So this is the whole concept of the Quran. You'll find this concept of accountability, this law of Itmamul Hujjah, pervading the Quran in such a intense way. as I said earlier on, that you start reading the Quran with this emphasis in mind that it's a book of dialogues, and you'll rediscover the Quran. It's such a thing which is so apparent that once you just give attention that there is a dialogue going on, you'll discover that dialogue yourself. And similarly, once you discover that the harsh verses are being talked about in the Quran relate to the prophetic era, and that prophetic era has been left for us to immediately, consult and understand. And then, of course, then there is the other part of the Quran as well, which does not relate to does not relate directly to accountability or Itmam al-Hujjah. Thus, for example, we have verses which relate to morality, verses which relate to the Sharia, which relate to our faith, for example, Tawheed, to the hereafter, the arguments of God, of proving God, for example, or substantiating His oneness. Similarly, there are several other things. So I'm not saying that, this whole topic pervades the whole Quran, this topic of accountability, but a major part of the topic of the Quran relates to this accountability. And if we don't understand it the way we have just, described, we'll end up, as I said, playing the role of God, which He played in the times of messengers, but as I said, today it is no longer applicable. So I think I'm going to take a break because we have Maghrib, and then there's a short thing that I'm going to discover, that how exactly the structure of the Quran organized so that this whole accountability process and the way these two denominations, the idolaters and the people of the book, have been dealt with in the Quran, and how we must keep on reminding ourselves that these two entities, they do exist today. For example, Hindus may be idolaters, maybe, and the people of the book, of course, they are there, but the idolaters of the Quran and the people of the book of the Quran are not the same as the idolaters of today and the people of the book of today. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So we're going to start the second session. So just to sum up what we've just gone through in the last 1 hour. So we've just discussed that the genre of the Quran, category of the Quran, or let me say the style of the Quran, a more appropriate word, is that it's a book of dialogues. And the second thing that we discussed is that if we go through this, the Quran in the way that I've just explained, then a bulk of this dialogue is basically, it constitutes, I would say, in a way that while we're living in this post-prophetic era, the Quran belongs to the prophetic era. So this dialogue, of course, would be something which relates to the prophetic era. And while living in the post-prophetic era, there are certain areas in the Quran, specifically the punishment part, in which the Almighty creates lesser days of judgment on the face of this earth, so that these lesser days of judgment can always remind people who are living in the post-prophetic era, like people like us, that the judgment which took place of these nations, it took place in this world. Our judgment has just been deferred to the day of judgment. So basically, you can, in one word, I can say that the topic of the Quran is this accountability. And this accountability, which is going to ultimately take place on the day of judgment, is substantiated for people like us living in the post-prophetic era by constantly, when you read the Quran, we find that this accountability took place in this world and people were punished. So therefore, we must not be unmindful that our accountability is also at hand. And it's not going to take place in most cases in this world, but yes, definitely in the hereafter. So this is our position here in the post-prophetic era. And the most important consequence of this is that when the Quran speaks of punishing disbelievers or killing them or not befriending them, it is specifically talking to the idolaters or the Jews and Christians of the era of the Prophet of God. And they must not be mistaken. They must not be extrapolated in any way that the Jews and Christians of this era are the same Jews and Christians or the idolaters of this era, because, as I said, fundamentally, in this era, the truth is delivered by God through His messengers, and once they intentionally deny the addressees, then they are punished. But in this era, neither are God's messengers sent, nor can we claim that as preachers of God, of the religion, we can communicate the truth to its ultimate form. So this is just the prerogative of messengers of God. They are God's representatives. They deliver the truth. We can never do that. So if we are mindful of this fact, then we will realize that accountability, it pervades the Quran. Accountability in one era took place in this world, in the other era it's going to be deferred. So if this, I mean, this short summary of what I've just said is rather apparent. So I'll now try to divide the structure of the Quran, or explain to you the structure of the Quran, how this topic has been enshrined in the Quran. So remember, the basic topic of the Quran is this accountability. And of course, this accountability in the Quran, remember, you have to understand this, that the Quran is a book which belongs to the prophetic era. And we are living in the post-prophetic era. So when I talk about the fact that accountability is the topic of the Quran, so I'm talking about this accountability which took place in this world. Remember, I'm not talking about the accountability, I mean directly of the accountability that's going to take place. Yes, that is going to take place. Yes, they were warned. But I'm going to explain that how this accountability of the prophetic era, which of course is the era in which the Quran was revealed, how it is described in the Quran. And I think when I'll try my best to explain the way it has been explained in the Quran itself, and it will become apparent to you how this accountability, the way it has been mentioned in the Quran, it was perfectly achieved in this world, and in such a grand manner that all that we can do is marvel at how the Almighty actually set up these lesser days of judgment. So remember, the last time that lesser day of judgment was set up was in the times of Prophet Muhammad. So every Prophet of God had those lesser days of judgment, but the last time it took place was in the era of the last prophet. So the Quran is now talking about the accountability which is going to take place in the era of this last prophet. Okay, so you also know that the basic addressees of Prophet Muhammad, I mean, they can be divided into two. One of them are the people of the book, and the other one are the idolaters or the polytheists. So basically, these people of the book generally lived in Medina, and the idolaters lived in Mecca. So we find the Quran having Meccan surahs and Medinan surahs. So Meccan surahs, when they discuss about non-Muslims or disbelievers, they are generally talking about idolaters. And when the Medinan surahs talk about disbelievers, they are generally talking about the people of the book. So because generally idolaters, they inhabited Mecca, and the people of the book inhabited Medina. So these are the two denominations with whom that dialogue took place, and I said it was like a back and forth dialogue. At times that dialogue would be in the form of a monologue. So monologue means that it's like a one-way sermon in which like a speaker is responding, or maybe making a speech. And at times the dialogue would take place in the form that once you say something, you are responded to as well. So there would be a back and forth as well. But as I said, when I use the word dialogue, it holds good for a monologue. It also holds good for a sermon, because basically it's like a speech and a back and forth conversation that's taking place. Okay, once again, let me turn ourselves to the human plane. So as I said, generally we human beings, when we write a book, for example, if I had to write a book, or I mean anyone would have to write a book, it has a certain topic, generally the topic would progress in a linear way. I mean, this is how human beings talk about books or think about books. And it's like a climax or a conclusion which occurs right at the end. So it's the last chapter generally which has the climax, isn't it so? I mean, generally there are anti-climaxes, there are certain other instruments of literature as well. But in the very broad sense of the word, climax generally takes place. I mean, you start off with a chapter, you build a theme, you draw arguments, you answer objections, and then you have maybe a general sort of a statement that you have to make, and then you ultimately draw a conclusion, which is the climax. So this is how we human beings have been trained to write a book, and I think most books, they follow this pattern. But the Almighty has actually, I mean, being God himself, he has actually followed an entirely different pattern. And the reason I think that he's followed a different pattern is that the two basic addressees of Prophet Muhammad, remember, people of the book who were in Medina, and the idolaters or the polytheists, who were in Mecca. So the Prophet's ministry actually extended for about 23 years. So he was here for about 12 years in Mecca. He migrated to Medina, and then another 11 years. So something like that. This is how he progressed. So he first addressed the idolaters while living in Mecca. As tradition has it, he was 40 years old when he was called to this ministry, and he continued for a decade or so, and then he migrated to Medina. So in Mecca, it was basically his own nation, the Quraysh, or the idolaters who were being addressed. And once he went to Medina, it was the people of the books, and they were mostly Jews actually, very few Christians there, who were being addressed there. And as I said, they were spoken of their own beliefs. For example, the people of the book of Arabia, especially the Jews, they would regard Uzair, Ezra, the son of God, like Christians would regard Jesus to be the son of God, etc. So they had their peculiar beliefs. So now the Quran has been arranged in a way. Just keep this in mind, this division, that the addressees of Prophet Muhammad are these two, and amongst these addressees, of course, when I'm talking about these addressees, I'm talking about the fact that these are the addressees who had actually become his enemies. Otherwise, of course, we had Muslims who had accepted faith. So I'm just going to refer them in a way that you would understand that these are his addressees who had accepted his version, I mean his faith, or his call or his message, and they had become part of him. So it's like saying that they are his followers. So, but these idolaters and the people of the book, of course, they were at daggers drawn with Prophet Muhammad. Then we had another category called the hypocrites, the munafiqun. So these hypocrites were a subcategory of the people of the book. You'll not find any idolater, I mean, you'll not find the hypocrites amongst these idolaters, because they were people who had said that we expressly, subscribe to polytheism. So the category of the hypocrites was never found in amongst these idolaters. You'll find these hypocrites who were present amongst the people of the book. So they were not here, and they were present here. Pardon me. It's like a. This is a general category. You'll find them in amongst the people of the book, but they were not here because they expressly said that we don't believe. We accept that there are more than one gods. Okay, if you keep this distinction in hand, and then also understand that the worldly accountability. Remember, it's the worldly accountability that we're talking about. Is basically the theme of the Quran. Now, the Quran has been divided into 7 chapters. And these 7 chapters, I'm just going to make this point before you. So this is chapter 1 ends here. This is chapter 2. This is chapter 3. 4. I think we're going to run out of space. So it's 5 here, 6 here, and 7 here. So basically, if you go through the Quran, you'll find that it has been divided into 7 chapters. And these 7 chapters, one would imagine, if this is the case, then the way we are used to writing books, for example, if this is the theme of the Quran, that there is a worldly accountability going to take place, we have 2 denominations, the people of the book and the idolaters, Muslims forming part of Muhammad's followers, and then of course the people of the book having a subcategory of hypocrites. So generally, the way things would progress in a human plane would be that yes, they are addressed simultaneously in various ways, and ultimately the accountability that's going to take place, which remember is the theme of the Quran, that how this final verdict of the Quran or God himself was delivered, it would be something would be situated here, because once the build-up is there, for example, the people of the book would be addressed, their arguments would be allayed, they would be answered, objections would be answered. Similarly, the same case would go on with the idolaters. And once everything had been done, which means that Itmamul Hujjah had taken place, the truth had been conveyed, the final chapter would be something in which this accountability would be expressly mentioned, as is in the Quran, and you would find the idolaters being, the Almighty ordering the idolaters that they should be put to death because of the fact that there is no forgiveness for shirk. And the people of the book, for example, they would be allowed to live on their own religion once they once they profess the fact that yes, they would be living under the subservience of Islamic State. So this is how I would imagine, if this is the data that I've been given, that on a human plane, this is generally what we would do. But the Almighty has actually, He's adopted an entirely different way to express this whole theme. And just to let you know how he has actually done this in the Quran. So I'm just going to draw a skewed line, which means it's bent towards one side more. Now, the problem, I'm not going to try to imagine what God would be thinking, but I would imagine that because there are two primary addressees of Prophet Muhammad, the people of the book and the idolaters. So the scheme which the Almighty adopted, was that he addressed the people of the book first in the Quran. And so here is the chapter number 1. This is the climax, which is chapter number 2. And then we have, let's say, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So what has happened is that the Almighty, because of the fact that there are two different addressees, the pattern he has adopted is that the bulk of the Quran, which was revealed in Mecca, remember, the bulk of the Quran, in fact, 2/3 of the Quran is supposed to have been revealed in Mecca. So,
Are these 7 chapters or these are 7?
These are 7 chapters, not 7 manazil. I'm just going to explain that. So,
Chapter is not a surah.
chapter is not a surah. So, the chapter is not a surah. So that's a different division. I'm just going to explain further. So manazil is a different division, which is generally used by the Huffaz. So these 7 chapters, remember, are chapters in which, the way the Quran has been arranged is that the idolaters, remember, living in Mecca, and they form 2/3 of the Quran. So they are discussed in this ascending order sequence right up to chapter 2 in a way that these 5 chapters, 7, 6, 5, 3, and 2, they discuss the way the Almighty delivered the truth to these idolaters in Mecca. And ultimately in chapter number 2, once they had been diagnosed as people who are not going to give up, who are going to deny out of intention, who have been arrogant, Surah Tawbah, which is the climax of the Quran, I would say, which is the 9th surah, and it forms part of, So this is where the Quran starts actually. And this is chapter 1. So what happens is that from 7th to chapter number 2, and I'm just going to hypothetically, so that you're able to understand what exactly are the divisions of these chapters right here. So just to let you know that if you start the Quran from here, because it begins from the Arabic side, so chapter number 1 starts with Fatiha, which is the first surah, and ends on the 5th surah, which is Surah Ma'idah. So this is chapter number 1. So this is just a further explanation. I'm just going to finish this diagram later on, but just to give you an idea that what exactly is meant by a chapter. So the first chapter starts with Surah Fatiha, which is the first surah, ends on Surah Ma'idah, which is the 5th surah. So here is chapter number 1. Then the second chapter starts from Surah An'am, which is the 6th surah, and ends on the 9th surah, which is Surah Tawbah. So chapter number 1 from Fatiha to Ma'idah, chapter number 2 from An'am, which is the 6th surah, to the 9th surah. And then chapter number 3, it is from the 10th surah, which is Surah Yunus, and it goes to surah number 24, which is Surah Nur. So this is the 3rd chapter. So 1 to 5 is the first chapter, 6 to 9 is the second chapter, 10 to 24. I mean, these are surah numbers. So 10 is Surah Yunus, 24 is Surah Nur. Okay. So the fourth chapter, it begins with Surah number 25, which is Surah Furqan, and it goes right up to Surah number 33, which is Surah Ahzab. Okay. So this is the fourth chapter. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 chapters. Okay. Now going on to the fifth one. It begins with Surah number 34, and from Surah number 34, it goes to Surah number 49, which is Surah Hujurat. So Ahzab ended the third chapter. From the fourth chapter, begin with Surah number 34, which is Surah Fatir, which is Surah Saba, and went all the way to Surah Hujurat, which is Surah number 49. And then the sixth chapter started with Surah Qaf, which is the 50th Surah. It goes right up to Surah Tahrim, which is the 66th Surah. This is the sixth chapter. And then the seventh chapter goes to the end of the Quran. This is Surah number 114. And this is Surah Nas, the last Surah. And here we have these 7 chapters. So the Quran basically has been divided into 7 chapters. The way it has been divided into these 7 chapters is that every chapter begins with one or more than one Meccan surah and ends on one or more than one Medinan surah. So in each of these chapters, the ministry of the Prophet is described in some way or the other. I mean, at times a partial Meccan period would be described, at times a complete Meccan period would be described, at times a part of the Medinan period would be described, but always it follows one rule, that every single chapter begins with a Meccan surah, it always ends with a Medinan surah. And then the next chapter would always begin with a Meccan surah and then a Medinan surah. And this is how this distinction is made. And as far as the Quran is concerned, if you are able to understand this diagram, then I can probably explain that as far as these groups are concerned, or these chapters are concerned, as you can call them, they have been arranged in a way that chapter number 2 is the climax of all the chapters. So it's not like a linear book that we had imagined, that of course the subject would start here and there would be a climax here. On the other hand, what the Almighty has done here is that in this particular, sequence from Surah Fatiha to Surah Tawbah. Remember, Surah Tawbah is the 9th surah, and on the 9th surah ended the 2nd chapter. So in this sequence, the Prophet, the ministry of the Prophet was something which was addressed to the people of the book, which is about 1/3 of the Quran. And from the 7th to the 2nd chapter, it was addressed to the idolaters. Remember, there were 2 addressees. So instead of adopting a linear approach in which perhaps what would happen was the discussion between the various groups would have become jumbled up, because every denomination has a different belief, it has a different set of backgrounds. So instead of mixing them up, what was done was that the chapters were arranged in a way that chapter number 2 formed the climax, which meant that in the Meccan period, of course, the idolaters were addressed, and they were addressed in a way that if we have the sequence of the Quran such that the 7th and the 6th and the 4th and the 3rd chapter are read in this order, and then of course the first 2 chapters are read in this order, then we'll find chapter number 2 in which the worldly accountability of the people of the book and the idolaters had taken place. So remember, in Medina, basically the people of the book were the addressees. So for them, if you find from Surah Fatiha until Surah Tawbah, so there are these 9 surahs, you'll find the people of the book being addressed in all these 9 surahs mostly, and of course Muslims as well. Whereas in all these chapters from Surah Nas, which is the last surah of the Quran, right up to Surah Tawbah, if you read this in the reverse order and this in the forward order, you'll find that here all the idolaters are addressed and here all the people of the book are addressed. So I think in our understanding, what has happened is that instead of having a linear arrangement in which both these denominations would have been discussed simultaneously and thereby would have become juxtaposed upon each other and maybe caused a lot of confusion, because it was a dialogue that was had been taking place. In order to clarify that dialogue as much as possible and to streamline it, the course adopted was that one whole set of denomination was discussed in 4 chapters, in these 5 chapters, and one whole set of denomination, which are the people of the book, were discussed in this stream. But ultimately in Surah Tawbah, once the accountability had been reached, which meant that the truth had been, unveiled in the ultimate form, in the final chapter, the people of the book were, of course, punished for denying the truth, and their punishment took place that they would remain subservient to the Islamic polity by paying jizya. They'll not be put to death. They'll be allowed to live on their own religion. But for the idolaters, it was the reverse. They were to be put to death, because if they would not accept, then just as polytheism is to be punished by death in the hereafter, a similar situation would have arisen in this world. But what happened was that in the times of Prophet Muhammad, all his nation, all the Quraysh, they accepted faith, barring a few individuals. So for them, the punishment of destruction never took place. So the idolaters were addressed here. The people of the book were addressed here, and ultimately in chapter number 2, the accountability which was to take place for both these groups was pronounced. And if you read the Quran in this sequence, such that you read Surah Fatiha to Surah Tawbah, you'll realize that you're reading much more about the people of the book. Go home in the Quran, and you read the Quran once again. Do make a note of this, that the accountability of the people of the book is being discussed from Surah number 1 to Surah number 9. And the accountability of the idolaters is being discussed from chapter number 7 in the reverse order to chapter number 2. So in other words, chapter number 2 is the climax of the Quran. Why? Because in the climax of the Quran, which is the second chapter, the last surah of the second chapter is Surah Tawbah. So you find that Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is not written on Surah Tawbah. Why? Because it is the surah of accountability. So because it's the surah of accountability, it is here that a judgment is pronounced. So if you start reading Surah Tawbah, you'll find that the first half of the surah deals with the idolaters and their fate. And it is said, فَقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ سَكِفْتُمُوهُم, that wherever you find these idolaters, just chop off their heads, because that's going to be their fate in the hereafter. And now you are authorized, instead of cyclones and tempests and earthquakes, it is now the swords of the believers who have been authorized to take their lives. But as I said, this never took place, because all of the Prophet's nation most of them accepted faith. And then the other thing was that as far as the people of the book are concerned, for them the Quran said, قَاتِلُوا الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَلَا بِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. There's a whole verse in the Quran, which is the second part of Surah Tawbah, which says that for the people of the book, because they are monotheists, they shall not be put to death. They will be allowed to live on their own religion, but the only thing is that they'll have to live a life of subservience and pay jizya to the Islamic State, and therefore this would be their punishment. As far as the hypocrites are concerned, they are a subcategory of the people of the book. So they are discussed also wherever the people of the book are discussed. But in Surah Tawbah, the last half of Surah Tawbah, the Surah Tawbah is divided into three sections. The first section, it deals with the idolaters. The second section deals with the people of the book. And the third section deals with the subcategory of the people of the book, which are the hypocrites. And they are also taken to task, and they are told that if they don't follow the way, they don't follow suit, they don't follow the way that has been prescribed, then their fate is not going to be any different. So in this way, the worldly accountability of the nations of the world, of course, to whom prophets of God were sent, was described in the Quran. And the last time that this accountability took place, in the time of Prophet Muhammad, was enshrined in the Quran, so that people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era have a very, very clear idea that this is how the Quran has been arranged. A further distinction within these chapters is that the surahs within a chapter, they occur in pairs as well. So you'll find that if you read through the Quran, because that's not my topic today, it's just information that you might need later on, that within a chapter, remember, it starts with a Meccan surah, every chapter, and ends on a Medinan surah. And within each chapter, surah occur in pairs. The surahs occur in pairs. So a very typical prayer, for example, you will know is Surah Falak and Surah Nas. They're so close to each other that it's so unmistakably clear that they are pairs. And if you go through some of the works of the Farai scholars, you'll find out how they have, come up with the fact that which surah is the pair of which surah. And when we say a surah, the surah they occur in pairs, it means that there are certain things which are perhaps concise in one surah, and they are elaborated upon in the next surah. At times in one surah, you'll have arguments drawn from history about a certain premise, and its paired surah will have the same premise, but the arguments, for example, would be drawn from human nature. So there is a stylistic difference in these pairs, but they complement one another. So each chapter would have typically theme as well. So every chapter would have a theme. Every chapter would begin with the Meccan surah and end on a Medinan surah. And within each chapter, the surahs would occur in pairs. And if you read through the Quran, you'll find Surah Tawbah, as I said, it's the climax of the Quran. And I mean, it's such an irony of fate that a lot of our people who teach the Quran to people, I mean to our militant groups, they actually teach Surah Tawbah and tell them that look how the Quran deals with disbelievers and this is how they should train themselves, without realizing that, of course, as I said earlier on, that this chapter has given you information about what happened in the times of Prophet Muhammad. I mean, he was authorized only to deal in a way that the Quran describes, that he was authorized to chop off the heads of the disbelievers, he was authorized to wage war as a means of punishment. But if you don't realize this, you'll start reading the Quran in a way that every single verse which has a specific import, it has a specific context, it has a specific addressee, you'll end up extending that to your own selves, as I just mentioned earlier on, that people like Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar, when they thought that they are being told to kill the disbelievers, they thought, okay, why not go ahead with that? Without realizing, as I said, that this was something which was mentioned in the Quran as the accountability of the nation of Prophet Muhammad. And for us, it was a reminder and, of course, not something to be followed. So this is a very, I mean, as I said, it was rather an oversimplification, but I've tried my best to explain to you that this is how we read the Quran, that when you pick up the Quran and you try to make a sequential sense into it, then if you read the Quran in a way that the first 9 chapters will be dealing with the people of the book, the rest of the Quran would be dealing with the idolaters, and the final climax of the Quran occurs in the 9th chapter, 9th surah, which is the final surah of the 2nd chapter, in which that accountability, remember, this was the theme of the Quran, this was the basic topic of the Quran. This accountability is physically shown. So Surah Tawbah says that you have to kill these mushrikun, you have to kill you have to fight with these disbelievers, and you have to take to task these hypocrites. So that accountability is found in Surah number 9, and precisely for this reason, because accountability is going to take place, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is not written, and this is the only surah in which Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is not written. So with this, I come to an end to my presentation, and just to give you a small short summary of what we have just discussed, that as far as the Quran is concerned, if we don't understand the Quran in the form of a dialogue or a monologue or a conversation, one of the greatest things that we come across is that disjointedness in the Quran. The fact that we are not able to make sense of a lot of topics that come up simultaneously. So if we account for the fact that it's basically a conversation between different groups, immediately some of the aspects of that disjointedness will clarify themselves, because, as I said, they relate to different topics, and at the same time, questions like why is Buddhism and, for example, Hinduism not discussed in the Quran would also be answered, because, as I said, it's a dialogue set in 7th century Arabia between living entities who were there in Arabia. There was not a single Buddhist or a Hindu in Arabia, and precisely for this reason, he never figured in any conversation in the Quran. So therefore, it would be unreasonable to say that why is it the Quran does not mention Buddhism and or Hinduism. And then we talked about the fact that as far as worldly accountability is concerned, if we do not understand the Quran through it, we will end up reading the Quran in a way that we would think that a lot of verses of the Quran in which this accountability is mentioned, relating to messengers of God, relating to their followers, as if they address us also, and not makes this distinction that in the post-prophetic era, we have to understand this accountability, that our own accountability is going to be deferred to the Day of Judgment, but in order to keep on reminding ourselves that yes, this is going to take place, we would keep reading the Quran and see how these previous nations, they went through this accountability in this very world. And then finally, I tried to explain to you that as far as the Quran is concerned, the way it has been arranged is that it's like it's skewed to one side, it's more inclined to one side. Chapter number 2 is the climax of the Quran, and in this chapter number 2, we have 4 surahs. The 4th one is Surah Tawbah, in which judgment is pronounced. In other words, the accountability is pronounced, and that accountability, once it was pronounced, we came to know that this is how the ministry of the Prophet ended with him when he passed away, and some of his mission which was left to the companions to have been fulfilled, they continued with that mission, and we know that they did not conquer Rome or Persia because people think that it was like extended they were extending their territory. No, it was basically they were punishing people for denying Prophet Muhammad or the messenger of God. So basically these were punishments which were meted out the way they would be in the hereafter. And it would be wrong to assume that they were basically attacks made on non-Muslim territories by the Sahaba to conquer them. So they were not conquests, as I said. They were something of this form of a punishment. So if this is understood, then of course we are able to gauge the fact that the Quran has a lot of specifics in it and it has a lot of generality in it. But if you ask me one thing, that how would we distinguish whether there's something which relates to us in the post-prophetic era, and how do we know that there are verses which are related to just the prophetic era? I mean, remember that we just discussed that in this post-prophetic era, we cannot invoke some of the verses in the prophetic era. So a general rule of thumb would be that all verses which relate to punishment for polytheism, which is of course in Arabic we call it shirk, disbelief, which is called kufr, and the third thing would be apostasy, in which actually you are accepting faith and then leaving it. Apostasy, which is called irtidad. So wherever these three themes occur in the Quran, polytheism, I mean these three themes occur in the Quran, and there is also a punishment mentioned for them. Wherever it does, we will always come to the conclusion that it refers to the prophetic era. All verses of the Quran in which the punishment of polytheism is mentioned, or the punishment of disbelief is mentioned, or the punishment of apostasy is mentioned, there will always be verses about which the Quran says that these, I mean Almighty Himself says that these are the three crimes, I would say, or sins about which God says that only I am authorized to punish them. I carried out this punishment in the era of God's messengers, in the prophetic era, and I'll do it again in the on the day of judgment. So polytheism, disbelief and apostasy, the Almighty says, were punished by me in the prophetic era, and I'm going to do it again on the day of judgment. But in the post-prophetic era, neither is anyone authorized to punish people for polytheism, nor for disbelief, nor for apostasy. Why? Because it needs the presence of a messenger of God. These punishments are only authorized to the punishment to the messenger of God by God Himself. So in the post-prophetic era, these cannot be invoked. You can only learn a lesson that how these punishments were administered in the prophetic era, and how we have to remain aware that our doom is also going to be, I mean, it's forthcoming if we don't realize what we are told, and ultimately we will all be be punished for this as well. But as far as the post-prophetic era is concerned, no one can punish, no government, no human being can punish anyone for either of these three crimes, even if people commit them. So even if people are worshipping gods, I mean more than one god, even if people are disbelieving, or even if people are leaving the folds of Islam, all of them cannot be in any way invoked in the post-prophetic era. So these are the three verses about which the Quran is specific. All the rest of the Quran, you'll find, as I said, you'll find the Sharia verses, you'll find the Aqaid verses, you'll find the morality verses being discussed copiously. Obviously, they relate directly to us. But as far as these three are concerned, as I said, they relate to the prophetic era, and they cannot be extended beyond that. So this is basically a summary of the Quran, I would say, or the introduction to the Quran that you might have, or you might be reading, or you might have read, or maybe you plan to read, vis-a-vis what has been presented by the Farai scholars. I know this must have raised a lot of questions in your mind, or maybe even objections, so I am here to answer them.
Was an amazing presentation. Allah bless you. So right here, I have previous question also on the previous slides, but I forgot those. So just focusing on here. We know that these are two different stages and eras. And according to this slide, it seems like the pre-prophethood era and post-prophethood era, we should not be taking those commands, particularly post-prophethood era. But as historical facts, we know that prophets, Sahaba, they went to those places even after Prophet ﷺ's death,
right,
to implicate his commands while he was gone.
right.
So could you please
Okay.
explain that?
So you see, I can also illustrate this by a short diagram. So this is the Arabian Peninsula. This is the African Horn, the Asian Horn, and this is the African part. It's like this. So it goes like this. So we have Abyssinia here, we have Yemen here, we have Hijaz here, which Hijaz actually is the place where Makkah and Medina are. So in the 6th year of the Prophet's ministry, he wrote letters to 12, I would say 12 rulers. And all these 12 rulers were on the periphery of Arabia. And they were actually delivered the same message as was delivered to the people of Mecca and Medina themselves. So these were the areas which were lying on the periphery of Arabia. And the Prophet, because he was stationed in Medina at that time, he sent them letters and he said that, well, I have been sent to these people, but I'm going to come to you as well. So I'm going. My own message is being delivered now in Arabia today, and for you also, you need to watch out that if you deny the truth intentionally, then you shall be taken to task, because you being individuals for whom the truth has the same value as the people of the book of your area. So therefore, you would also be called to account, because your own books, for example, we know that the Christians who were residing there, their own books predicted the arrival of the last prophet. So for them, the last prophet was not someone new. So they already had knowledge of the last prophet, that he would come amongst Arabia. So once he arrived, he just announced his arrival as part of what was found in their own predictions. Similarly was the case with the Jews and people who were bordering in these territories. So the Prophet was an introduced personality to them. He was no one new. He just announced that I am the same person whom your own books are speaking of. So I am going through my ministry. So you still have time, because these were sent in the 6th Hijrah, and we know that the Sahaba attacked them in the 13th Hijrah. So they had 7 years. So in these 7 years, they had all the time to come to the Prophet, talk to him, verify whether he's the one who was spoken of in their own scriptures, go back and then do whatever they would like. So they had those 7 years, and those 7 years was the time in which the Prophet was living, at least in 6 of them, because he died in 12 Hijrah. So he was living in those 6 years. They had all the time to come to him. But as far as his message was concerned, so not only was it communicated to Makkah and Medina, but it went to them as well. So the only thing was that the Sahaba, they just completed what the Prophet had begun. It's not something that they did afresh. The Prophet had already delivered the truth to them. He had already warned them that he had come in response to the prophecies that they are there. And they had the time to come to him and also witness the lesser day of judgment, which was going to take place in Arabia. For them, it was, again, as I said, the Old Testament. It's not my topic here, but I can show you that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, these lesser days of judgment are also depicted in the very same way as they are depicted in the Quran. So you also find in the Old Testament exactly the same story, exactly the same theme. So in accordance with that, the Sahaba were told that the Prophet himself, of course, did not live to see that, but he had done his job. He had communicated the truth to them in ultimate form in response to the predictions that were there in the Bible, in the Old and the New Testaments. And also they had those 6 years in which they could come and verify or ask questions or raise objections. So once he passed away, the Sahaba only finished what he had already done. Had he lived, he would have done it himself maybe, but because the Almighty had other plans, he died, and in the next couple of years, the Sahaba actually just completed the task that was, assigned to the Prophet himself. So this is how it happened. It's not that they did it themselves. It's not that they extended their territory. It was basically which the Prophet already had initiated, in fact finished. It was just the final part which was left to the Prophet. Remember, I explained to you that in the times of the messengers of God, in the prophetic era, the task of punishment was generally assigned to tempests, earthquakes, or the elements of nature. But in the time of the last messenger, this was replaced by the swords of the believers. So the punishment which was meted out in the prophetic era, in the earlier times, through natural disasters. This was the natural disasters part was replaced by the swords of the believers, and this is how this actually happened. That those believers, which were the Sahaba, they undertook this task and they finished off what the Prophet actually had initiated.
But with that, then by that explanation, one could argue that the message has already been brought and has continued, for example, for us, and so the message is ongoing for the other people as well, and therefore we can continue to keep doing.
Yes, that's a very brilliant question, and that is exactly how fiqh has generally actually taken it from. So this is how our scholars view it, and they say that because the Prophet had done his job, so therefore if they had conquered this territory or punished people, so we would continue doing that. And this is precisely how Osama bin Laden and the rest of the lot have argued. But you see, the Quran has made this point. It says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا, that this punishment can only be given by the Prophet himself, until the presence of the Prophet is there, because he is the one who is going to deliver the truth. In his absence, the truth becomes vague. In his absence, the truth has to be re-established. So yes, there are other areas, but punishment cannot be given in the absence of a messenger of God. That is what the Quran says. And that is why I said that you have to realize, in the prophetic era, remember this prophetic era, God takes matters in his own hands. He sends his envoys. They deliver the truth. They have miracles to show. They have so many things in which they are ideals of humanity. They are morally so pure that you can really vouch for them. But in the post-prophetic era, people like us are delivering the truth. So we cannot be in any way, we are far from perfect in this way. We are not messengers of God. So the Almighty says that this punishment is only authorized when messengers are there. Why? Because the truth is made evident by them in its ultimate form. And people who deny the truth, they deserve punishment. But in the post-prophetic era, we cannot deliver the truth in its ultimate form because we are not messengers of God. So only in the areas in which the Prophet sent this message, and that too, remember, they are the ones who were actually waiting for his arrival. So they were given this chance of 7 years to come to him and verify this claim, or otherwise, and discuss with him. But since the passing away of the messenger, this facility is no longer there. The messenger is no longer there. So it cannot be extended beyond this era. Once he had passed away, now it was all curtains. You could only continue to the time, maybe a couple of years, like 10, 15 years, in which the task was completed, in which the truth had been unveiled, and now the Sahaba were only punishing them. So once that punishment was finished for those 12 countries, so there were these 12 countries, and they have been actually outlined, Bahrain and some of the other countries. So these 12 countries, once had been finished off, or maybe the truth had been delivered, beyond them they could not step. So if you read history, you'll find that once some of the soldiers tried to cross beyond those 12 countries, he was stopped in the times of Umar radiallahu anhu. He said that no, you cannot go beyond this, because this is the territory which has been outlined. This is the territory in which the Prophet himself was present. But once you go beyond that, for example, if you go into Sindh, because at that time you know that within the first 60 years, Muhammad bin Qasim stepped into Asia. But then that was the era beyond that, the prophetic rule, and in which those, he did not account for those 12 countries as well. So this was a very specific area, and this could not have gone beyond that.
I think rather than saying that the life or the death of the Prophet, I think if we could define it, if they rejected the direct message or direct command of Rasulullah, then they would have been, committing a sin.
But since that can happen even today, so we have to specify.
Direct message from the messenger.
Yeah, you mean the direct addressees, exactly. The immediate addressees. So that's what I'm saying. The immediate addressees who are present in the time of the messenger of God. So only they can be punished. Beyond them, you cannot go that, because you see, as the Quran repeatedly says, only God through his messengers is able to do that. No one other has this authority. Yes. Yes, sir.
Same line of thought that the ladies have been asking. In the same line of thought, the ladies have been asking. So the four Khulafai Rashidin, whose era finished 32 years, and then Muawiyah's time starts. Does this I'm finding hard to make this extension or the order finishes by the Khulafa Rashidin, or it continues?
Actually, it continues in the first 60 years. I mean, that is the time when the era of the Sahaba were in power. So once they were deposed, I mean, the people who came after them, who were the Tabi'un. So once we entered the era of the Tabi'un, this no longer was the case. But let me also point this out, that our traditional scholars, they don't recognize this fact. So since they don't accept this law, I mean, what I've just described is something which Ustaz Amiruddin Farahi has pointed out for the first time. Because they don't acknowledge this, because they think that if the Prophet was, I mean, alive and he had done his message, then it was for all times to come. So even today we can attack people or kill people the way the Quran has mentioned them. So by not recognizing this law, virtually we think that we are still living in the prophetic era. So our common scholars would say that the prophetic era started with Adam. It's not going to end with Prophet Muhammad, the way I'm explaining. They say, on the contrary, this prophetic era is going to extend to the day of judgment. So it's like saying that right until the day of judgment, we are still living in the prophetic era. And whatever the Prophet did in his own times is still applicable to our era. So this is how our common scholars explain this.
Without the presence of the Prophet?
Even without the presence, because he said that he did his job. So once he did his job, that is for all times to come. So our traditional thought makes us, I mean, it takes us to this extent that we are still living in the prophetic era. The Prophet's message was universal, and that universality actually demands that we just not restrict him to his death, and we have it extended to the whole, era within human history. And this is where the Farahi school diverges. It says that we have to realize that punishment can only be given to people who are living in the prophetic era. It cannot be extended for reasons which I have just explained. So in a nutshell, you can say our traditional scholars would do exactly all the things which messengers of God were authorized in the post-prophetic era, because for them there is no post-prophetic era in fact. Every era is a prophetic era for them.
But if that's the case, then how do you explain the verses about freedom of religion and, the differentiation between the prophetic and the non-prophetic era?
So you see, as far as these verses are concerned, like La ikraha fid deen, there is no compulsion in religion, that is that no one is going to force you to accept this. So what they mean is that you have your own choice to accept the truth or whatever you think it is. But if you do accept what the truth is not, or what is the untruth, then you're going to face the consequences. It doesn't mean that you're not going to face the consequences. The freedom is regarding the choice that you make.
No, but you face the consequences on the day of judgment,
right?
Not from the people, punishing you because you don't.
So this is an exception to that. So the La ikraha fid deen verse actually relates to the Sharia part of our religion, in which this prophetic era is not invoked. So we are talking about the post-prophetic era. So in the prophetic era, there was no such thing as La ikraha fid deen. It was La ikraha fid deen as long as you had the choice to accept or not accept. Otherwise, their fate was decided in this world. However, today, the way the things are, we have this choice to accept or not accept. Fate is just going to be deferred. It's just a question of shortening that span. In their time, the span was, let's say, 25 years or 30 years, and for us, it's like forever.
Sorry, I don't keep going. In terms of the traditional scholars, how do they explain the verses that say, you can continue killing non-Muslims, and the verses that say, you have freedom?
Like ikraha deen.
So
yeah, because so see, they say that this is what the Prophet said earlier on. Initially in Mecca, when his ministry was going on and there was no state created, so this choice was given to them. But once this choice was finished, it had a particular time bar to it. So once that time was reached, this could not be invoked again. So they related to a particular time bar.
So this doesn't apply to...
It does not today for them. Okay. And this is a question that we need to ask them, that why is it that you find these verses in the Quran today and though you don't give the choice to people?
So the same verse, lakum dinukum waliya din, right?
No, actually, Surah Kafirun's verse has a very different ring to it. People think that it's basically a verse of tolerance. In fact, if you look at the context of the surah and the placement of the surah in this chapter in which it is placed, you'll find it's actually a verse of acquittal It's like saying, okay, to you what you do, and to us is what we are going to do. It's not said in a tolerant way. It is said in a way that, okay, then you'll face the consequences. If you're doing whatever you do, then the consequences are to be faced by yourself. So generally this verse has been interpreted as a verse of tolerance, but in fact it is not a verse of tolerance. It only says that, okay, then wait for what was going to happen.
You did mention that how the structure helps the topic.
Right.
So in the same way, does the style also help the topic?
Absolutely, because see, when the style of the Quran is in the form of a dialogue or a monologue or a sermon, so you see, you can see how the Quran or the Prophet of God is communicating his message to people, and he has been given this distinction that he is talking to different people at the same time. So when the Quran was rearranged in this form, this distinction was, actually made, in which the people of the book were made to the addressees in the Medinan period and the idolaters in the Meccan period. But when the Prophet himself was there, he was talking to both of them. So at times when he was in Medina, he was also speaking about the mushrikun, which he had left behind in Mecca. So in his own ministry, it was taking place at times simultaneously. But once when the Quran was rearranged in the form of a book and chapterization was given, so in that chapterization, the addressees were bifurcated.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. It was very interesting talk, very thought-provoking. I have many questions, but maybe I'll restrict to one for now. Mm-hmm. And this relates to your initial part of presentation regarding, you mentioned that Quran is a dialogue.
Right.
So to my understanding, dialogue is between two folks. Like there's
so actually, as I said,
towards the end you did mention that it's a monologue, and monologue is maybe a subset of dialogue. So your initial premise,
right.
Is dialogue.
So what I was trying to explain was that it's a book of conversation. So for lack of a better word, what I was trying to implement or hint at, that it's a back and forth conversation. So it's not always back and forth. At times you'll find a particular person speaking and you don't find the response being given by the addressee. But there are several instances in the Quran in which you'll find that it's a back and forth dialogue as well. So, but it's not always the case. So at times the dialogue is two-way. There are two people speaking, and at times it's just like a monologue or a sermon in which the Prophet is speaking, and it's a very long, lengthy speech. But then at the end of the speech, you'll find either a response from the addressees, or it may be a silence, because, as I said, the scene shifts to a new scenario. So remember, the Quran is not just a book of dialogues. It's also a book in which acts and scenes change, in which the scenario changes. For example, the Battle of Badr would be taking place, and suddenly the battle would end, and there would be a comment on the battle by the Almighty Himself, and something new would be brought up. For example, the believers or the disbelievers would have said, or the hypocrites to be precise, that why should we spend out of our own pocket so much? And the Prophet would tell them that this is a loan that you're giving to the Almighty, and it's going to be returned manifold back to you. So at times what happens is that the questions are raised within that monologue, and once that whole monologue is completed, it's not like a back and forth within the monologue. That sermon would be complete, and then there would be a cumulative response, like a comprehensive response. So it covers all these things. When I say a book of dialogue, it refers to a monologue, a speech, a conversation, a back and forth sort of thing. But the point that I was actually trying to make were two. One, that only people who figure in that dialogue will be there. You cannot expect Hindus and people living in other areas of the world also figuring in that conversation, because it was a living dialogue between entities who were present. And two, the disjointedness in the Quran that we often feel is not because the topics are disjointed, but because the dialogue personnel change. And when they change, then they have their own peculiar background in which they're talking about a specific topic, which might not relate to the previous topic in a direct way.
Another question related to, I think, this discussion is, you mentioned prophetic era and then post-prophetic era. So prophets before our final prophet, the people who followed them or didn't follow, they were given explicit punishment, and the believers were spared. But in the case of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see there were battles, for example, Badr, where both some of the Muslims, the believers, they also martyred or they were killed on Uhud, which was the second battle where actually we lost, the Muslims lost.
Right.
So it is not as explicit as was in the previous prophets.
Right. So for them, the Quran actually explained that for them it is like life itself, and martyrdom itself is the greatest life that you can get in the hereafter. It is the highest form of life itself. So although they were killed in those battles and they of course sacrificed their own lives, and as such you could say that they were not rewarded in this world, but they had that ultimate reward which martyrdom carries. So shahadat or martyrdom has that ultimate reward that the Quran says, bal ahya'un walakin la tashurun, that they are living in God's presence. You might not be knowing what their life is, and at the same time this is the highest status that you can imagine about people who die.
This does not apply to people of previous prophets.
So of course that was not the case, because for them the destruction took place of the whole nation, because for them a very large part of the nation ended up denying the prophet, and there were very few believers in most cases, and they were sifted out, and all of them lived, because of course they couldn't have been left to the mercy of those disasters.
My question. You were saying that there will be denial in, directly to the command of Prophet. Then there will be disaster for them or punishment for them. This is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this is how Allah has established His style, right? So when we see Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's life, and we know that he was kicked out from Makkah, went to Medina, and served the people over there, and then he came back to Makkah, the Fatahun Mubin, right? That day when he gave the kind of universal forgiveness to everyone,
right.
Hindu, idolaters,
and the people of the book,
munafiqeen, everyone, right? So does this contradicts by any means to the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
So that's also a very good question. Actually, this was the time when the Itmamul Hujjah process was still going on. So the truth was still being communicated, and they were still being given this respite. So the Surah Tawbah verse, which actually, that they still had a chance. So they were living in that respite period. So remember, when the Almighty destroys people, He does not do so immediately. He gives them that chance, that opportunity to reconsider. And so the time that you're talking about was that particular period in which that opportunity still was there, that you could have your way, the way the Almighty said. But once that time expired, which was the time around the 10th Hijrah or the 9th Hijrah, when that final Hajj took place, when the Surah Tawbah says that وَأَذَانُ مِنَ اللَّهِ إِلَى يَوْمِ النَّاسِ حَجِّ الْأَكْبَرِ, that in the time of the Hajj Akbar you'll relate this to all these disbelieving nations, all these mushriks, that their time is now up. So this actually came a year after Fatah Makkah, almost a year after that.
So then there was any killing?
There was not, because all of them accepted faith, except a couple of them.
Like Hinda, Prophet said, don't come to my...
She accepted Islam later on.
So how does the Quran clarify, which laws are to be in the prophetic era and the pre-prophetic era? So how does it say? How do I know as a lay reader that this applies only to the prophets and this applies to
right? So remember, I just explained a little while ago that there are three areas which are specific to the prophetic era. All verses which deal with the punishment of polytheism, you cannot apply them today. Similarly, all verses which deal with the punishment of disbelief, which is kufr, you cannot apply them today, because this is something which only God can punish. He did so in the times of His prophets, and He'll do so in the Day of Judgment. And apostasy, which is... So these are the three areas which are specific to the prophetic era. All the rest of the Quran, as I said, it has so much to offer. For example, verses on morality, verses on faith, verses which remind us to be good individuals. So they're all there, and the very context reminds us that it's for all times to come, for everyone. However, wherever these three punishments are discussed, not just polytheism, but the punishment for polytheism, not just disbelief, because disbelief is discussed at a number of occasions, but the punishment for disbelief and the punishment of apostasy. So wherever the punishment of these three crimes are concerned, the Almighty makes it clear that He says that only I have the prerogative to punish them. I did so in the era of my messenger of God, and I'm going to do it again on the day of judgment. But in the post-prophetic era, I mean, this is something which is confined to the prophetic era. In the prophetic era, God says, I did it. I didn't do it directly. I did it through my envoys, my representatives who are messengers of God. I'm going to do it again on the day of judgment. But this era, which is the post-prophetic era, no one is authorized to do so, because this is the prerogative of a messenger of God, because he's my representative.
So if that is clear in that Quran, then where is that discrepancy where people like Osama bin Laden, they sort of take it upon themselves?
Yes, so that's another very good question. That you see, what has happened is that unfortunately this law has been presented in the form of a dialogue. Remember, one of the difficulties of the Quran is that I just explained to you that at times the dialogue and the monologue and the sermons which take place, when they are directed towards individuals, and when you have, for example, the words in the Quran like for example, you say, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people. So what has happened is that at times in the context of the Quran, the word an-nas does not mean mankind. When I talk to you, I say, oh people. So when I'm saying, oh people, I'm not referring to people who are outside this room. I'm just referring to people who are in front of me. So verses like Ya ayyuhan nas became a cause of this misconception, because people thought it was a universal directive. So everyone is included. Whereas, of course, in context, an-nas means, or people mean the people the Prophet was talking to. So this is one of the reasons. There were several other as well. And the style of the Quran, if not understood the way I just explained through the works of my teachers, then you would have this confusion still existing. And because they think that an-nas is a common word, it means people. So therefore, and another thing is that they say that the example of the Prophet is the best example. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. So whatever he did, we have to follow. So they make a generalized statement. So if he killed, we're going to kill. If he was affectionate, we're going to be affectionate. But after a certain time, we will not be affectionate. So they follow the Prophet exactly without realizing that there were certain things which were specific to him.
So it seems like there's no direct ayah that would explain this.
There are several verses. For example, in Surah Yunus it says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ, which means that for every nation there is a messenger. وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُم. So when their messenger comes, قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, their matter is decided in this world and no one is wronged. So you see, there are so many verses in the Quran which actually speak of this law, but somehow it has eluded human understanding, I would say. And one of the reasons for that is also that I may point out that the Quran has seldom remained the means of deliberation in our Muslim Ummah. You will find very few Quranic scholars. Even today, our madrasas, the senior most person in the madrasa is called a Sheikhul Hadith. He's not called a Sheikhul Quran. So you see, unfortunately, in the last 14 centuries, the Quran has seldom remained the object of deliberation. It has mostly been used to read for the departed souls, like just to give them reward, or to maybe do some other random things, but it has seldom been used to obtain guidance from or to research on. Because, as I said, this is an unfortunate happening which took place very earlier on. And even today, if we reflect on our own lives, if you look at the madrasas, because I have this experience of talking to the madrasa people as well, the Quran does not figure in their discourse. It's just read as a translation at times, and that too in a recent way, introduction. Otherwise, formerly, the Quran was basically used to memorize, so that it could be read in the Taraweeh prayers, and that is all. Even the memorizer himself, the Hafiz himself, would not know what he's reading about. So unfortunately, this treatment of the Quran from us is the main reason why it took 14 centuries maybe for a person like Farai Saab to come and point this out. Otherwise, it is so apparent that it would have been done much earlier, I would have supposed, by earlier scholars, had the Quran become the object of direct deliberation. Yes?
Regarding the division of 7 chapters. So should we say that this is like a general trend, that the first 2 chapters, they're addressing the people of the book, and the other 5 are addressing
yes, it's a general trend. Otherwise, we have in between we have addressing the other denomination as well. But the general trend is that the people of the book are addressed. Surah Tawbah is a combined surah in which all these, because it's the final surah.
But
Yes, it does. It expresses the mushrikun actually.
Yeah.
So Surah Muhammad is, as you can see, it's a surah which is
It also talks about punishment, like killing their necks and stuff.
it does. So that's what I'm saying. You see, at times there's this cross-referencing as well, but broadly, from chapter number 7 to chapter number 2, you'll find the idolaters being discussed broadly. So Surah 47 actually falls in the other line.
And Surah Hashr, for example, I think that talks about.
It also talks about the people of the book. Yes. So there are instances. You see, within a chapter, you have the Medinan and the Meccan surahs both. So don't forget that. So there are Meccan surahs and there are Medinan surahs. In the Meccan surahs, you'll find the idolaters being discussed, and in the Medinan surahs, you'll find the people of the book being discussed. So it is not that all the chapters have just the Meccan surahs or just the Medinan surahs. They are always an amalgam of Meccan and Medinan surahs.
For example, Surah Anfal, just before Tawbah.
Right. So they.
Talking about mushrikun.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. It is in spite of the fact that they are placed in the second group or the second chapter.
So, but then it's really a general trend. It's not that.
I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that in the Meccan surahs of each chapter, you'll find the idolaters being discussed, and in the Medinan you'll find the people of the book being discussed. But in the 7th to the 2nd chapter, a bulk of that chapter in general discusses the people of the book. Of course, it does not preclude the idolaters, because there are Medinan surahs and there are Meccan surahs. So if there are no other questions, we can wrap it up? Okay.
I have some questions.
Please.
First of all, I thank you for explaining so elaborately, and it's for a good understanding of reading the Quran. And my question is, unfortunately, not about this topic. I think I have gained a lot from this, and you explained it so well and numerous times. So probably no question about this. But my question is another one. Two questions. One is that this day of judgment and that's only for the humanity only, or it's for rest of the creation as well?
For all people. I mean, you mean the other than human beings?
Yeah, that's the first.
Okay. So let me answer this first question. As far as the Quran is concerned, we do know that there are two types of or two categories of creatures who will be called to account. So one of them is the jinn kind, because the Quran tells us that just as messengers were sent to human beings, they were also sent to the jinn kind. So what we can know of that on the day of accountability, on the day of judgment, that human beings and the jinn kind would be brought to judgment. As far as other forms are concerned, the Quran does not discuss them, and so we should assume that if you're talking about animal life or you're talking about plant life, for them there is not going to be any judgment, because the Quran says that they have been created for the benefit of mankind. So if we kill plants, if we use plants for eating vegetables, for example, or if we kill animal beings for consumption of their meat, this is what we have been authorized by God Himself, because these two creatures or these two forms of living beings, they don't have any independent will or any independent, I would say, freedom of choice. They have been primarily created for humankind, for their consumption.
And the second question is that we don't find any prophets sent to the areas where throughout the history of humankind, most of the civilization existed in either China or India, and we don't find any traces of prophets. Instead, we find a particular area where most of the prophets.
Actually, the Quran tells us that there are a lot of prophets which it does not mention, and it only mentions those prophets about whom the people of Arabia knew, because you see, they were being addressed, and they could, in all probability, there could have been prophets sent to China or to maybe even India or to Mongolia or the Far East, but the Quran never mentioned them. So the Quran says, "Rusulan qad qasasnahum alayk wa rusulan lam naqsusum alayk." So I have mentioned prophets which existed, and the Quran says also there were many prophets which God has not mentioned in the Quran. And there is also another theory in which people think that because Hinduism started off with monotheism, I mean they were Tawheed, they were followers of Tawheed. If you read the Veds, which is the earliest book of Hinduism, so there is this conjecture, I think, which is pretty valid, that the Prophet Noah's teaching actually reached this area. through some other means. And the time also seems to be very similar when Hinduism started. So we cannot preclude other prophets from other nations. The only thing is that they have not been mentioned in the Quran, because the Quran says it only mentions those prophets which the Arabs knew, because it was meant for the Arabs to communicate it to them, because they passed by their ruins. The Ad, the Samud, and the people of the Shuaib, they all had their territories within Central Asia, within Palestine and within that area. So they were familiar with those places, and precisely for this reason they were mentioned, and some of the prophets that might have been sent to other regions were never mentioned.
I mean to say that throughout the history that even beyond Quran, we don't find traces of prophets in those areas. Why is that?
Yeah, as I said, this is what history tells us, and it might not be very true, because you see, history does not hand out everything, and the Quran says that a lot of prophets were sent, which I have not mentioned in my book. This is what the Almighty says, and that's what I think, that they must have been sent to other places. It's only that the Quran does not mention them, and history does not mention them as well. But this does not mean that they did not go there. And as I said, if you talk about Hinduism, for example, it is so heavily polytheistic in nature today. But if you read the earliest books of Hinduism, which are the Vedas, you'll find such beautiful monotheism being discussed that it would be as if you're reading the Quran, maybe, because there's no concept of any polytheism in the earliest books, which does show that there must have been a prophet sent to them. Maybe Noah or maybe someone else.
Yeah, right now is not the topic to discuss Hinduism. I believe that there's no such thing as Hinduism. There's Jain religion and other religions. That's like most of the regional religions evident in all parts of India. So from north to south, you find different.
So Jainism is a form of that. It's a subset.
We generally call it because of Hindus living in the Indus civilization. That's what we generalize them in.
Yes, I believe that's not correct. We should not generalize them. They are two distinct entities.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.